Washington, D.C. is in flames. While the British march toward the White House, one woman refuses to leave empty-handed. She isn't grabbing jewelry or silver, but a massive portrait of George Washington, the very soul of the American spirit. Dolley Madison saved the nation's pride that day, but she had been saving its president for years. Why did James Madison, a shy, frail scholar, need a wife whose flirtatious charm held the presidency together? Today we meet the woman who turned the parlor into a battlefield, and the small man who drafted the future. Philadelphia, 1783. The American Revolution had technically reached its formal conclusion with the Peace of Paris. Yet for James Madison, the peace was far from final. While the east coast of North America was fast changing as the 13 individual colonies sought a new degree of political representation, Madison was living through a personal and intimate crisis in the parlors of Philadelphia. He was a man of intellectual and legal rigor, a respected scholar who was already becoming a rising figure in the Continental Congress. But his early life had done little to prepare him for the messy reality of the human heart. He was 32 years old, a small, frail man, possessing a wider intellect, but a spirit that was often guiltily unwilling to accommodate the unpredictability of romance. Around the time that the new government was struggling to manage its war debts, Madison found himself staying at Mrs. Merryhouse's boarding house, a place that served as a rare oasis of social connection for the delegates. It was here that he encountered Catherine Floyd, affectionately known to history as Kitty. She was the daughter of William Floyd, a prominent New York delegate and a member of a wealthy family who had been a signatory of the Declaration of Independence. Kitty was just 16 years old, possessing a spirited laugh and a rebelliousness that stood in a stark contrast to Madison's own quiet, puritanical demeanor. Despite the age disparity, Madison was clearly an intelligent student of her character, and by early 1783, the pair had entered into a solemn and formal engagement. In the late 18th century, an engagement was not merely a romantic pursuit, it was a binding legal and moral contract. It inculcated the children of the elite into the rigid social hierarchies of the American aristocracy. For Madison, a man who had been educated in the classical humanist tradition, this union was to be the final piece of his social respectability. He and Kitty exchanged miniature portraits, tokens of an honorable devotion that they believed would last a lifetime. Madison began planning their future with the same scientific breakthroughs of logic he applied to his political essays, assuming that a marriage, much like a constitution, could be built on the foundation of shared values and social etiquette. However, the harsh reality of the frontier and the fast-changing world of the colonies was about to deliver a blow that no amount of rhetorical logic could soften. In the summer of 1783, Kitty returned to New York with her father. Madison remained in Philadelphia, waiting for the arrival of his bride with a deep anxiety. But the letters he received were increasingly cold and distant. Then in July, the Kitty shock arrived. She sent him a letter, sealed with a piece of rye bread, a traditional signal that the engagement was completely over. She had found another suitor, a young medical student closer to her own age, a man who possessed a certain rebelliousness and physical energy that the frail scholar simply could not accommodate. The effect on Madison was devastating. He did not go to war with her family, but he was decimated by a psychological unrest that lasted for months. He was a prominent man who had helped secure the independence of a nation, yet he was humiliated by a teenage girl. He wrote to his closest friend, Thomas Jefferson, a man who was then building his own reputation as an honorable figure of the Enlightenment. Madison's letters were filled with a lingering shadow of the spirit, a hypochondria that characterized his fragile health for the rest of his life. Jefferson, in a display of his own intellectual and legal rigor, replied with a cold, analytical comfort, advising Madison that no woman was worth such a heavy sacrifice of his own domestic peace. This rejection was not merely a romantic failure, it was a painful realization of his own social standing. Madison realized that in the mid-18th century, a man of his unyielding arrogance of mind was often a ghost in the parlor. He returned to his 9.5-acre farmstead, seeking a sanctuary in the works of the great Greek and Roman authors, historizing his own pain through the rhetorical writings of Cicero. He had won the respect of his political colleagues, but he had lost the battle for the heart. This period of isolation forged a man who was even more determined to master the mechanics of power, a man who understood that if he could not govern a single heart, he would at least govern a nation. The dark sorrow of his first love remained a permanent feature of his character, a shadow across his history that would only be lifted when a very different kind of woman stepped into his world, a woman who would turn the melancholy Madison into a legendary figure. As he looked toward the future of the 13 colonies, the lawyer was still a scholar of his own grief. The stage was set for a decade of political glory, but for James Madison, the memory of Kitty Floyd was a bitter reminder that in a world of laws, the heart remains the only authority that refuses to be governed. Philadelphia, 1794. The city was the beating heart of a new republic, a place where the rhetorical logic of the Enlightenment was being hammered into the spirit of law. But Philadelphia was also a city of long shadows. Around the time that the American government was settling into its role in the 13 individual colonies, the capital was recovering from a devastating catastrophe. The yellow fever epidemic of 1793 had decimated the population, claiming the lives of nearly 5,000 citizens, 10% of the city, in a single agonizing summer. This invisible enemy did not care for wealthy standing or political representation. It tore through the middle classes and the elite alike, leaving behind a landscape of broken families and young widows. It was within this volatile, fast-changing world that the fates of two key figures were about to collide in a way that would shape the future of the American presidency. James Madison was now 43 years old, a man possessing a wider intellect but a physical constitution that was famously frail. He had earned a reputation as the father of the Constitution, a brilliant scholar who had mastered the works of Thucydides and Cicero to draft the blueprints of a nation. Yet in the spiritual world of the heart, Madison remained a man of deep isolation. Following his earlier rejection of romance after the Kitty Floyd disaster, he had retreated into the logic of his law practice and the heated debates of the Congress. He was an intelligent student of power, but he was an amateur in the art of social grace. He lived in a world of books and puritanical discipline, a man who seemed more like a ghost in the parlor than a suitor. In stark contrast, Dolley Todd was a woman of incredible, magnetic energy. At just 26 years old, she was already a veteran of the harsh reality of frontier loss. She had been raised in a Quaker household with rigid religious beliefs, but she possessed a lively spirit that could not be suppressed by a gray shawl. In the 1793 epidemic, the yellow fever had taken her husband, John Todd, her infant son, and her parents-in-law in a matter of weeks. Consequently, Dolley was left as a young widow with a surviving son, navigating a comfortable but lonely existence in Philadelphia. She was a member of a prominent family, but she was also a woman who understood that in the mid-18th century, a widow's security was as fragile as a New England winter. The introduction of these two opposites required a matchmaker of legendary reputation. Enter Aaron Burr. Burr was a major figure in the Senate, a man of high position and a college friend of Madison from their days at Princeton. He was also a man who appreciated the rhetorical logic of a good match. Around the time that the social season of 1794 was beginning to bloom, Burr approached Dolley with a request that was as exciting as it was intimidating. The great little Madison, the finest mind in the government, wished to be introduced to her. Dolley, possessing a sharp wit and a rebelliousness of her own, reportedly wrote to a friend that she was preparing to meet the man who was currently drafting the soul of the nation. When they finally met in the spring of 1794, the disparity was striking. Madison was small, quiet, and dressed in his typical somber black, while Dolley was vibrant, sociable, and possessed a charm that could accommodate even the most arrogant of political rivals. Indeed, she saw past the frail constitution and the questioning of authority that characterized Madison's public life. She saw a man of profound and honorable depth. Madison, for his part, was utterly captivated. The melancholy scholar was suddenly an intelligent student of a different curriculum. He began courting her with a speed that shocked his political colleagues, recognizing that Dolley was the moderating voice his own restless spirit had been seeking for decades. The courtship was fast changing the trajectory of Madison's private history. Within months, the man who had struggled with the social etiquette of Philadelphia was certain in his devotion. On the 15th of September, 1794, they were married at Harewood, the large farmstead of Dolley's sister in what is now West Virginia. The ceremony was a transition from the dark sorrow of their pasts to a union based on mutual respect and intellectual partnership. Madison had found more than a wife. He had found a political representation of the very grace he lacked. Dolley was a woman who could manage the domestic requirements of a large estate while simultaneously mastering the social logic of the capital. This union was a perfect example of how the American story is often decided in the parlor as much as the courthouse. By marrying Dolley, Madison had traded his solitude for a partnership that would later prove ideal for a revolutionary presidency. The great small man now had a partner who could turn his rhetorical logic into social power. As they settled into their life together, the shadows of the yellow fever and the memory of Kitty Floyd began to retreat. The lawyer had found his muse, and the young widow had found a protector. The stage was set for the emergence of a power couple who would define the identity of the White House. But the true cost of their greatness was yet to be paid. For now, the music had returned to the parlor, and James Madison was no longer a man alone in the woods of history. The man known to history as James Madison was often described as a figure of sheer physical insignificance. Standing just 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 100 pounds, he was a man possessing a frail constitution that seemed perpetually on the verge of surrendering to the common sicknesses of the 18th century. Throughout his early life, he was haunted by what his peers called bilious fevers and sudden, terrifying seizures, leading many to believe that the great small man would never live to see the complete independence of the colonies. Consequently, Madison retreated into the spiritual world of books, becoming a dedicated scholar of the law, earning his reputation for an unyielding intellectual rigor that could out-argue any man in Virginia. He was the brain of the Revolution, a man who mastered the rhetorical logic of the Enlightenment. But in the fast-changing social etiquette of the parlor, he was a ghost. In stark contrast, there was Dolley Payne Todd. If James Madison was the serious ink of the Constitution, Dolley was the vibrant golden light that allowed the world to read it. She was a woman of incredible magnetic energy, possessing a spirited laugh and a flirtatious charm that was legendary among the social circles of Philadelphia. Her early life had been typical of the strict Quaker community, a place where the curriculum centered on the New England primer and the puritanical religious beliefs that demanded the plain style, gray dresses, silent worship, and a strict rejection of the vanities of the world. However, the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, which had claimed her first husband and infant child, had triggered a profound transition in her soul. Dolley emerged from that tragedy not as a broken widow, but as a woman who understood the absolute fragility of life, and she chose to spend hers in the pursuit of happiness. This created a perfect example of a perfect opposite. Around the time they were married in 1794, the disparity in their characters was striking. Madison was a man of logic and rhetoric, who was often guilty of a certain arrogance of mind. Yet he was so painfully shy that he would often hide in the corners of his own parties, refusing to make eye contact with his guests. He was an intelligent student of political liberty and representation, but he was a pauper in the art of social connection. He needed a moderating voice, a partner who could accommodate his quiet, anxious nature and translate his massive intellect into social power. And in Dolley, he found a virtuoso of human nature. Dolley's transition from a plain Quaker to a high society socialite was a seminal moment in American cultural history. Upon her marriage to Madison, who was not a member of the Society of Friends, she was officially expelled from the Quaker Church. This allowed her vibrant spirit to finally worship freely at the altar of fashion and social etiquette. She traded her gray shawls for turbans of bright silk and gowns that mirrored the scientific breakthroughs in advance of the Enlightenment in Europe. She became famous for her flirty nature, a way of engaging with men and women that was not scandalous, but was profoundly effective at building political alliances. She was known for the Dolley squeeze, a firm, friendly pinch of the hand that made every visitor feel like the most important figure in the room. For James Madison, this was the ultimate sanctuary. Dolley became the bridge between his brilliant mind and the 13 individual colonies he was trying to govern. When he was too frail to attend a dinner, she hosted it with a grace that silenced his political rivals. When his questioning of authority got him into considerable trouble in the press, Dolley's parties at the Grand Farmstead of Montpellier would forge a social peace. She did little for the wider intellect in terms of legal theory, but she did everything for the psychological architecture of her husband. She cured his shyness by simply occupying the space he was too afraid to fill. Consequently, she wasn't just his wife. She was his social representative, a woman whose questioning of social boundaries allowed a shy scholar to become a successful president. This was the brain in the socialite, a relationship based on mutual respect and a shared rebellion against the rigid social codes of the time. While Madison analyzed the spirit of law, Dolley analyzed the spirit of people. She saw the man of honorable reputation beneath the small, silent frame, and she spent her life ensuring the world saw him too. By the time they looked toward the White House, the transition was complete. They were a power couple perfectly suited for a revolutionary era, a man who could draft the future and a woman who could make the world believe in it. The melancholy Madison had been saved by the radiant Dolley, and together they were about to forge the social identity of a new nation, proving that the greatest alliances are not built on being the same, but on being the perfect, vital half of a whole. Washington, D.C. in the early 1800s was not the affluent capital we know today. It was a raw, unfinished city of mud and dreams, a place where the reach of the law was short and the competitive spirit of political rivalry was long. James Madison was now the fourth president of the United States, a learned scholar of the law who had earned his honorable reputation by drafting the very architecture of American democracy. But the great small man faced a profound and visible problem. He was a man of rhetorical logic, not social grace. He could write a constitution, but he could not command a room. Consequently, the success of his presidency did not rest solely on his wider intellect, but on the political weapon he had married in 1794. Dolley Madison. By the time the Madisons moved into the executive mansion, Dolley had already begun to redefine what it meant to be the wife of a president. She recognized that in a young republic, where the 13 individual colonies were still wrestling with their identity, social etiquette was not a vanity. It was a form of soft power. While James was an intelligent student of political liberty and representation, Dolley was a virtuoso of human connection. She established what became known as the Wednesday night squeezes, Popular parties where the curriculum centered not on puritanical religious beliefs, but on the art of compromise. In her parlor, the angry spirit of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans was temporarily silenced by the rhythmic logic of conversation, ice cream, and her famous flirty charm. She was the moderating voice that her husband lacked, a woman who could turn a political enemy into a social ally with a single magnetic smile. However, the true exhibition of Dolley's honorable devotion was yet to be tested in the fires of war. Around the time that the diplomatic unrest with Great Britain was fast changing into an open conflict, the War of 1812 began to cast a dark cloud across the nation. This was the second global conflict of modern history for the Americans, a struggle that mirrored the 7 Years' War in its sheer intensity. While the British were victorious in Europe, they turned their sights toward the heart of the American experiment. By August 1814, the British Navy was dominating the Chesapeake, and the city of Washington was the primary target. The 24th of August, 1814, remains one of the most somber and dramatic dates in American history. While James Madison was away on the battlefield, seeking to manage the border disputes and the war effort, Dolley remained at the White House, a lone figure of defiance in a city gripped by terror. The British Army was fast approaching, and the residents of Washington were fleeing their farmsteads and homes in a state of blind panic. But Dolley refused to accommodate the fear. She waited until the very last moment, even as the sound of British cannons began to echo through the unfinished halls of the Capitol. She was not waiting to save her fine dresses or her personal wealth. She was waiting for something far more significant. Hanging in the state dining room was the full-length portrait of George Washington, painted by Gilbert Stuart. To Dolley, this was not merely a piece of art, it was the soul of the Republic, a physical representation of the honorable reputation of the Founding Fathers. If the British captured it, it would be a tragic and permanent exhibition of American humiliation. When the order to evacuate was given, she realized the frame was screwed too tightly to the wall to be removed quickly. In an act of absolute defiance against the approaching enemy, she ordered her servants to break the glass and cut the canvas from its frame with a knife. It was a master class in clandestine, action-packed bravery. Consequently, as the British entered the city to impose their vengeance, Dolley was already fleeing through the mud of Georgetown, the portrait rolled up and hidden in her carriage. That night, as she looked back from the Virginia hills, she saw the grim orange glow of the Capitol in flames. The British had burned the White House, the Capitol, and the Library of Congress, but they had failed to capture the spirit of George Washington. Dolley had saved the icons of the nation while the men in power were in retreat. This was the emergence of a new kind of American hero, a woman who used her social standing and her unyielding courage to preserve the pride of a country. When the smoke finally cleared, the transition was complete. Dolley Madison had not just been a hostess, she had been a protector. She returned to the charred ruins of Washington not as a refugee, but as the most beloved and popular figure in the land. She had established the blueprint for the First Lady, a role that was not about political power, but about the spiritual world of national unity. She had shown that while the president was the brain of the nation, the First Lady was its heart. Her actions during the fire cemented her place in the history of the 13 individual colonies as a woman of incredible magnetic importance. This was the political weapon that James Madison had relied upon for 20 years. While he provided the rhetorical logic for a nation of laws, she provided the emotional logic for a nation of people. Together, they were a power couple perfectly suited for a revolutionary era, a partnership based on mutual respect, and a shared fierce devotion to the American experiment. The fires of 1812 had done little for the physical structures of the Capitol, but they had done everything for the honorable reputation of Dolley Madison. She had saved the past so that her husband could continue to draft the future. The portrait was safe, the war was over, and the Queen of Washington was now a legend that would never truly be broken. Around the time that the Madisons were settling into their retirement at Montpelier, the grand farmstead in the rolling hills of Virginia, a quiet and internal tragedy was beginning to unfold. James Madison was a titan who had saved the Republic in the public square, but inside the walls of his own home, he was a man possessing a silent, empty void. Despite the clear and visible devotion between James and Dolley, they were never able to have biological children of their own. In the mid-19th century, an era where the curriculum of a man's life was measured by the sons he left behind to carry his honorable reputation, this was a quiet sorrow of the soul. He had framed the Constitution, but he could not secure his own bloodline. Consequently, Madison poured his paternal affection into a different kind of project. Payne Todd. Payne was Dolley's surviving son from her first marriage, the child she had rescued from the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. Madison, in a display of deep and honorable devotion, adopted the boy, treating him not as a stepchild, but as a true heir to the Madison legacy. He was an intelligent student, educated in the first stages of a classical humanist education, yet he possessed a wild spirit that no amount of rhetorical logic could tame. While Madison was a man of puritanical discipline and legal rigor, Payne Todd was a man of the fast-changing vanities of the world. He was a wealthy enough figure in the social circles of Washington and Philadelphia, but he was a man who preferred the thrill of the card table over the spirit of law. And here is the twist that history often overlooks. We are taught that the British were the primary agents of Madison's destruction, that the fires of 1814 were the ultimate sign of his struggle. But the truth is far more somber. The man who truly incinerated the Madison family fortune was not a British officer, but the son James Madison had raised as his own. Around the time that Madison retired from the presidency in 1817, Payne Todd's gambling addiction and poor management began to create a massive and permanent leak in the family's wealth. He was a virtuoso of debt, incurring ruinous losses in the saloons and gambling dens of the East Coast. The statistics of this betrayal are undeniable. Over the course of his retirement, James Madison was forced to pay nearly $40,000 of Payne's debts, a staggering amount in the early 19th century, equivalent to nearly $1 million in modern currency. In 1830, while Madison was trying to manage the ruin of his finances, he even had to pay for Payne's release from a debtor's prison. To accommodate these losses, Madison had to sell off portions of his wealthy farmsteads and even his precious collection of books. He was a man who had mastered the logic of a national economy, yet he stood helpless before the endless financial demands of his own son. This was Madison's Achilles heel. His unyielding love for Dolley meant he could never build a barrier against her son's rebelliousness. He was guilty of an honorable but catastrophic loyalty. This was a perfect example of the tragedy facing many of the founding fathers. Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, the three giants of Virginia, all died without biological sons to inherit their names and their properties. In the American story, where the transition from a colony to a nation was based on the idea of political liberty and representation, these men were paradoxically unable to establish their own dynasties. For Madison, the lack of a worthy heir was a grim reminder that greatness in the public world does not guarantee peace in the domestic world. He was an intelligent student of human nature, yet he could not solve the puzzle of Payne Todd. As the 1830s approached, the somber reality of his financial ruin was complete. Madison was a great scholar who was fast changing into a pauper. He sat at his desk at Montpelier, surrounded by the rhetorical writings of Cicero, while his son was losing the very ground beneath his feet. The melancholy Madison had been saved by Dolley's light, but he was being consumed by her son's darkness. The fires of Washington had been extinguished, but the fires of Payne Todd's debt were raging, proving that in the history of a great man, The greatest threats are often those that sit at your own dinner table. James Madison had drafted the future of a nation, but he could not save the future of his own house. On the 28th of June, 1836, the man who had drafted the very soul of the American Republic drew his last breath. James Madison was 85 years old, a historic figure who had outlived nearly all his revolutionary peers. He had survived the fires of the British, the border disputes of the 13 individual colonies, and the heated debates that shaped the Constitution. But as he was lowered into the soil of his beloved Montpellier, he left behind a legacy that was as sad as it was honorable. The great small man had written the rules for a nation, but he had failed to guarantee the security of his own house. For Dolley Madison, the transition from the Queen of Washington to a grieving widow was stark. For over 40 years, she had been the radiant light that allowed her husband's rhetorical logic to shine, the virtuoso of the parlor who turned political unrest into social peace. But with James gone, the shadows of the Madison estate began to close in. As we have seen, the fires that truly destroyed the Madison legacy were not lit by British torches in 1814, but by the rebelliousness and gambling debts of her son, Payne Todd. He was a man who possessed none of his stepfather's legal rigor or puritanical discipline, and he spent the next decade completing the ruin of his mother's standing. The statistics of this collapse were devastating. By 1844, the debts incurred by Payne Todd had become a crushing and unyielding weight. Dolley was forced to authorize the sale of Montpellier, the 5,000-acre farmstead that had been the heart of the Madison family for generations. She was forced to sell their precious library and even the enslaved people who had worked the soil of her ancestors, a sad proof of the era's economic importance. She moved back to Washington, D.C., living in a small house on Lafayette Square. Directly across from the White House she had once governed with such grace. To the public, she was still a member of a prominent family, a living icon of the founding era. But behind the closed doors of her parlor, the reality was a hidden reality of poverty. It is here that history offers its most profound twist. While the affluent elite of Washington continued to seek her social etiquette, Dolley Madison was often literally starving. She had no political representation, no farmstead, and a son who continued to drain her remaining wealth. But she was not entirely alone. One loyal friend remained, Paul Jennings. Jennings had been born into slavery at Montpellier, serving as James Madison's valet for decades. He had been in the room when Madison organized his last writings, and he had been by Dolley's side when she saved the portrait of Washington in 1814. Jennings had eventually purchased his freedom from Daniel Webster, yet he never forgot the woman who had once been the primary influence of the capital. In a display of pure and honorable compassion, Jennings began to visit Dolley in secret. He recognized that the Queen was living in a state of abject neglect. He, a man who had been owned by her family, began to bring her small sums of money from his own wages in baskets of food to accommodate her hunger. He did little for the wider intellect of the nation, but he did everything for the spirit of the woman who had lost everything. This was a masterclass in the human heart, a transition where the former slave became the benefactor of the former First Lady. While Payne Todd continued his reckless nature and debauchery, it was Paul Jennings who ensured that the widow of the father of the Constitution did not die in the cold. When Dolley Madison finally passed away on July 12, 1849, the transition was complete. Her funeral was a grand state affair, attended by the president and the elite of the 13 individual colonies. Yet she was buried in a borrowed grave because her own family could not afford a monument. This is the bitter and true cost of greatness. James Madison left behind a document that codified the rights of citizens in the spirit of law, a legacy that will outlast the scientific breakthroughs and the fast-changing politics of any era. But for the Madison family, the flesh in the farmstead rotted away, extinguished by the cold logic of a son who could not lead. Ultimately, the Madison story is a primary example of the vanity of power and the unyielding logic of reality. We build monuments of rhetorical logic and draft constitutions to secure the future. But in the end, the only thing that truly survives the fire is the spirit of human connection. James Madison drafted the rules for a nation, but it was a man he once owned who ensured his wife was not forgotten in the shadows. Power is a shadow. Reputation is a veneer. But a promise kept and a kindness shared is the only lasting independence that matters. The great small man gave us a nation, but it was the queen in the valley who gave us a lesson in the sheer beauty, in the sheer tragedy of being human. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to support the channel. See you in the next profile. Have a good day.